So we've covered Egypt and Mesopotamia in order to get a grip on models for the ancient Greek conception of the gods and heroes, respectively. And so the reason we're jumping into an overview of Greece now is so that we're prepared once we get onto the gods and heroes and then on to Homer. And afterwards, I'll be making a lot of allusions throughout the semester to ancient Greece, various aspects of its history, in order to make connections between myth and history. And so that's why I want to devote a day to giving you guys a background about ancient Greece. But hopefully some of the things I say will still be interesting to you, even if you have read a lot more than others when it comes to where the Greeks came from and all that. So I'm going to keep it really simple, and the key here is for me to have a sense that we're all on the same page so that I can throw out things like the Persian Wars in the future, and that'll mean something symbolic to you that will right away provide, fancy word, a comparandum, something to be compared to for you with respect to whatever we're looking at. Okay? So in that example, the Persian Wars, as you'll see, was pretty much the most important international war the Greeks partook in the historical period, okay, per se. And so what we'll look at today is that ancient Greece, ancient Greek history is divided into prehistory and history, like a lot of civilizations are, including Rome. And when we get to Rome, at the end of the semester, we're not going to focus too much on Rome in this class, but we definitely need to give a day to Rome in order to pay attention to how the Romans used Greek myth in order to construct their, and there's no other word for it, really, fabricate their early history. For Greece and for Rome, it's easy. What I'm giving you is the benefit of lots and lots and lots of history books about ancient Greece and Rome having been read and paying attention to how the historians categorize the different periods. And there, I'm happy to say, are pretty much two ways that ancient Greek experience is divided. And that is into prehistory and history. And there are three parts to each. Okay, now that will be the case for ancient Rome as well. Ancient Rome is also broken up into prehistory and history, but as we'll see, the kind of hint I gave you about the Romans stealing from ancient Greek epic and history in order to create their own early history has to do with, in the historical period of Roman history, there was pretty much a blank slate when it came to prehistory in the minds of the Romans living in that time, until the Romans of a certain period, I'll give it away, the beginning of the empire, constructed that early history, and then all of a sudden there was a prehistory accounted for. So when we get to Rome at the end of the semester, we're going to start in history, and then we're going to backtrack to prehistory. So we're going to talk about prehistory from the standpoint of a historical period that looks back at a fabricated past. When it comes to Greece, we don't have to do that, okay? Because even though the ancient Greek conception of their prehistory differs markedly from what archaeologists have discovered since then about the physical realities and, by extension, to some extent, as far as we can tell, the spiritual realities, the economic realities, etc., of the prehistory, still, the ancient Greeks had a conception from the very beginning of what their past was like. So it wasn't as easily manipulable, okay, as it was for Rome. And what is that prehistory? It all begins with a civilization called Minoan. Then there's Mycenaean, and then there's the so-called Dark Age. So what's going on? Minoan Civilization and Mycenaean Civilization have one thing pretty much in common, and that is that the only way to come to terms with how they really were, in terms of what the people were really doing as opposed to who they supposedly were in the myths that were tossed around the historical period of Greece, is that they both had a script, they both had writing, but not much in the way of what we would today call literature. We're talking around 3000 BC, around the time of the heyday of ancient Egyptian and Mesopotamia. So we talked about Heliopolis creation myth, and that's around 3000 BC, and then the Epic of Gilgamesh around 3000 BC. Okay, so we're talking contemporary things going on here. And so in Greece, you didn't have literature, whereas in Egypt and Mesopotamia you did. Although with the caveat that, especially in Egypt, we remember it was almost exclusively religious literature. So in other words, not literature that was intended to be distributed to the populace at large, but rather to be limited to the eyes of the pharaoh after he died. When you have all of those hieroglyphs inside of, on the walls of a pyramid like that and sealed away forever, what does that tell you? Yeah, it tells you to a great extent how much belief there was in the importance of the pharaoh doing the right thing in the afterlife. But another thing it tells you that will be interesting to us when we get into the Greeks and how they represented their myths in plays and other types of works that were intended for public consumption is that, as you can probably guess, in that case, there was a lack of ego associated with art. There was a lack of individuality pinned to those literary works in Egypt. Okay, so you didn't have, the equivalent of John Smith, writing this work. And oh man, isn't John amazing? So everybody knows about John, the way there was for Homer, the way there was for Hesiod. Okay, so that notion of an individual attached to what is considered to be creative work originated with the Greeks. Okay, you don't have a name for the Epic of Gilgamesh author or authors. You don't have that for Heliod's creation myth or any of those other early myths of Egypt either. Okay, for the good reason that wasn't the focus. Okay, that's not to do what Herodotus did and negatively judge those who weren't Greeks, but rather to point out that there was no priority given to individuals claiming their right to be acknowledged as the author of whatever work you're talking about, whether it be fine art, whether it be literature, etc. Got me? Okay. In other words, what's the real takeaway from that? Our famed culture today with celebrities from movies, reality TV people becoming president, and before that, Ronald Reagan, movie stars being president, all that. That stuff is very foreign to the ancient Greek mindset when it comes to this idea of entertainers, performers, artists, and of the greatest kind. I'm talking about Homer as well. Okay, being considered in the same breath as someone who was thought of as a viable candidate for office in the government or for being a great general in the military. They were completely different worlds. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. That was a long footnote contrasting Egypt and Mesopotamia on the one hand, but especially Egypt and Greece on the other when it comes to the individual versus a kind of collective responsibility for art. Okay, so the Minoan period we're going to get to when we get to the hero Theseus, because even though there were stories going around about Minoan civilization, which was centered on the island of Crete, the southernmost and largest of the Greek islands, right between Egypt and the Greek mainland, the southern tip of the Greek mainland. So you're thinking right between Egypt and Greece, and so kind of symbolically where you would expect it to be, given how much of a trading partner Egypt was with Greece from the very beginning. Okay, so we'll get to Minoan civilization later on in connection with Theseus, because as we'll see, the Athenians took Theseus as their indigenous hero, as their kind of number two after Heracles. Okay, and we're going to see that they did for Theseus pretty much what Narmer did with the Heliopolis creation myth, the idea of propagandistic use of myth. So we're going to get to that later. But the thing to take away from a known civilization for now, as far as what happened in it from an archaeological perspective, is that we can't read their writing, which has the name linear A because it's in a line, like our writing, and it's A as opposed to B, linear B, in Mycenaean Civilization. So that's the name of the two different scripts, or what we would call alphabets in our lingo. Linear A is the script of Minoan Civilization, and linear B of Mycenaean. And we haven't deciphered linear A yet. Michael Ventris in 1953 deciphered linear B. What was written, as far as what we have in our possession so far, in linear B was mainly inventory of palaces. So it helps a lot for understanding the day in, day out economic life of Mycenaean civilization, but pretty much zero in the way of poetry, literature, or anything like that. The problem with that is that there are those who think that Homer and what he did with his poetry, which of course is the apex of this class, was rooted in some kind of poetry that occurred in the Mycenaean period, and there's really no evidence for that other than purely circumstantial. That is, like, within Homeric epic itself, there are certain words that seem real old. And so there's a belief that his poetry went back to the Mycenaean period. But as far as what we found written in Linear B, it doesn't really support that idea. So there's a lot of debate about that kind of stuff still. Okay, so Minoan civilization, we have to rely almost exclusively on images, which is interesting, especially for the artistically inclined. I did a lot of research on Minoan civilization back when I was a grad student, and it was fascinating to read a bunch of articles written in words about a bunch of pictures, very art history-like. And so you have to look at a bunch of pictures and determine what they mean, and then you read the writing about the pictures, and then the writing about the pictures, and all of a sudden you forget that they're really pictures. You just got to the point where you're reading a bunch of writing and you forget that it's not about anything written, but rather just pictures. That's all you have to go by to interpret a civilization. It's kind of challenging. Imagine us doing that, right? All of a sudden, we don't have any script. We don't have any books. We don't have any thing written on the internet. We have nothing but images. So if everything just, a Black Mirror scenario, everything with script all of a sudden disappeared in one split second. And time went by, right? And all there was oral culture, people talking. We didn't have anything written anymore. It went on and on like that. And the alphabet was dead. And there was nothing but images. Try interpreting our world based entirely on that. It would be kind of difficult, right? No music, right? Etc. And that's kind of what we have to rely on when it comes to Minoan civilization. Now, Mycenaean is a little different because, like I said, we can read, thanks to Michael Ventris, Linear B script. We have an idea about what the palace structure was like, and by extension, the political system, based on the palace structure. And for our purposes, most important about Mycenaean civilization is that that's when two major things occurred. We'll put them in categories, just two, but it's really 5 if you look at it a different way. And that is, first of all, the Trojan War occurred in the Mycenaean period, around 1250 BC, but do put a 2000 date on about when it began, just to make it clean. Like you have the Sumerian stuff around 3000, and then you have the Babylonian stuff. When you have Hammurabi, that's about 2000. So think of Minoan as contemporary with Sumerian civilization and Mycenaean with Babylonian, if that helps you, okay, based on what we looked at before. And so around 1250 BC, as far as archaeologists and historians can tell, the Trojan War occurred between the Greeks and the Trojans. Okay, we're going to get into that a lot later on. Okay, that's like I said, the kind of apex of the class. And the other thing is that the 4 pre-Homeric heroes that we're dealing with in this class did what they did that was most famous about them. The 12 labors, Pericles, blah, 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 all the stuff that's most famous. Perseus, Medusa, all that occurred in the Mycenaean period as well. So the Mycenaean period is also nicknamed the heroic age by a lot of writers in the past. Of course, the word heroic can be very subjective if you're doing more than just describing the age, but rather giving a quality judgment to it, because there are those who would argue that later periods in Greek history are more heroic, and that's why that designation went out of vogue over the years. But just do realize that it used to be referred to that all the time, consistently, the heroic age. Okay? Because so many heroes came from it, including Pericles, the most important of all. Okay, enough of that for now. Okay, but the same thing goes for Mycenaean period. You pretty much have to rely on physical evidence, the remains of temples, the remains of palaces, and sculptures and wall paintings and things like that in order to really know who these people were. We're almost as lost as we are with the Minoan period. Okay, so then the Dark Age is easy to talk about. We are going to have a succession myth that we get to next. We're going to be talking about the ancient Greek conception of where the universe came from, and also how Zeus came to be the king of the gods in Olympus. And so all that kind of stuff is kind of mirrored a little bit, if you want to think of it that way, in what's going on here, in the sense that the Minoan civilization was overtaken, destroyed to some extent. What's a better word for it? Defeated. Okay, not quite destroyed, but allowed to stand and then overtaken by the Mycenaeans. And then the Mycenaeans were overtaken in the way they overtook the Minoan civilization by blank. Okay, there's a lot of debate about who they are, the ones who overtook the Mycenaeans. Quite often they're referred to very generically as the sea peoples, because they came from the sea. I mean, let's be a little more specific. Well, we can't be. And so that's a really nice designation to point out how limited we are in knowing exactly who they were. Now, there's a lot of books and articles written about it, and a lot of debate, a lot of fighting going on about who they were and all that. But for our purposes, what matters is that Minoan civilization was swallowed up, is a good way to put it, by Mycenaean. Okay, lots of Minoan elements in Mycenaean civilization. And then the Mycenaean civilization was swallowed up by whoever they were, the so-called sea peoples. They really were the ancestors, as far as we know, of the Greeks that followed them in the historical period. You see? So that's how we should think of it. Minoan overtaken by Mycenaeans, Mycenaeans overtaken by, for want of a better word, the Greeks. Even though that's an anachronistic name, because you didn't have a, quote, Greece, unquote, until the 1800s of our era. Okay? But you had a thing called Hellas, which is something close to it that we'll get to later when we talk about the historical period. Okay, you guys, and you should think of the Dark Ages beginning around 1000, because that makes it nice and neat. Okay, if you want to be real strict, maybe 800 is a better date to give. But we're talking 3, 2, and 1. 3, 2, 1, easy to remember. You could do worse than that. You could also do better than that. Okay, depending on which histories you're reading and which articles you're reading and all that. But the bottom line is that gives you a decent thumbnail of the relative time elapsing between these three periods. Okay, so we could call them a Minoan civilization, we can call them Mycenaean civilization, and then the Dark Age. What it's called dark for, and the reason I put quotation marks around it, not as much because nothing happened in the Dark Age. It's because we are relatively ignorant about it, and so we don't have enough to say about it to make an interesting day in a class like this, let alone, or even a civilization class, let alone a whole class devoted to it. Archaeologists are hard at work trying to say things about it that kind of contextualizes it, along with the other prehistoric and historic periods of ancient Greece, if you get my drift. Kind of archaeologists are struggling to incorporate it into the narrative of this whole picture of the ancient Greeks. And so, unfortunately, if I threw things out at you, it would have to sound kind of random. In the sense that, okay, there's still something like a palace here and a thing there, but as far as what went on, it's called dark not only because of our ignorance about it, which should remind you of the so-called Dark Age, the beginning of the Middle Ages, by the way. That's becoming less of a fashionable word for medievalists to say Dark Age, because now they know a lot more about it, and hopefully that'll happen for us with Greeks. But another reason, really big reason, that is going to segue into the beginning of the historical period is the loss of what in the Dark Age? Writing, script, something like an alphabet, a way to represent sounds on surfaces that are more or less permanent, or at least intended to be. Okay? It's a giant deal. That's a technology that today, with Kindles and iPads and cell phones, we kind of tend to take for granted, but that was the best they had. That was the most highly developed technology you had to think about how revolutionary that is, to have thoughts in your head, symbolize them on some surface, a tablet of some kind, and then transport that tablet far, far away from the source of where those words came from. And that's a giant deal. And we talk about the printing press all the time in world civilization classes, and for good reason. But it's also very revolutionary, and maybe even more so in the sense that it comes before the printing press, to come with the very idea of putting words down to represent sounds. Okay, now that sounds basic, and it is, but it's important to point out because there are what are called Homerists, those who specialize in Homer, or even just classicists in general, who argue that once in the first of three historical periods of ancient Greece, which I'll name in a second, the advent, seemingly out of nowhere, of the Greek alphabet, which, as you probably all know, I think everybody's heard of this, that ultimately comes from the Phoenicians in one form or another, from the East. But the Greek alphabet, according to some very authoritative ancient world scholars, otherwise known as classicists, may very well have been developed for the sheer purpose, at first, get ready, of recording the Homeric epics. Even if that's bullshit, which it might be. It gets across to you, it should at least, how damn important those epics were. That's what I want you to get out of that. Okay? Even if it's not true, which it probably isn't. It's just really hard to believe, right, that there would be that kind of elaborate technology, communication technology for two poems. But even if not, that's how important the Homeric epics were, and that's why they're the star of our class. Why we're getting, to the point where at the end of the semester, all I care about more than anything is that you guys can go out and read Homer on your own. Because once you read Homer on your own, you can read everything else on your own. It really does come down to that. Okay, believe me. Then Greek tragedy, Greek comedy, and then beyond that, into the Middle Ages, into the Renaissance, and beyond, into the modern age, blah, blah, blah. You need to master Homer, okay? If you really want to get into the groove with where things came from in literature. There's so many recurrent passages and motifs, archetypes, phrases, etc., that come from Homer. You wouldn't believe it. They do compete in our culture, in our English-speaking world, with Shakespeare along those lines. Okay, so now let's get into historical period. The first of the three historical periods of ancient Greek history is called the Archaic. And what that means in ancient Greek is ancient. So to us, all this stuff is ancient. But to those living in the next period, called the Classical period of Greece, classical, around the 5th century BC, I'll give you the dates in a second. The Archaic period was ancient in the same way that the Founding Fathers are kind of ancient for us. Okay? So when you let's take out these dates. Classical period begins in 490 BC, and I'll give you a reason why I'll be a stickler for that exact date in a second, or maybe 10 seconds, or maybe 2 minutes, I don't know. Archaic, on the other hand, begins around 800 BC. So about a couple hundred years after the Dark Age. So what does that mean? It's fairly shady in terms of, not shady, obscure, in terms of what's going on with from 1,000 to about 800 or so. Okay, but once you get into about 800 BC, you begin with the Archaic, which is called, quote, ancient, unquote, by the Classical period, because 300 years before them, the beginning of Greek history per se began. The distance from these guys, these people, guys in the sense they're the ones who wrote the history, and the Archaic period is a longer distance than us to the Founding Fathers of the U.S. It's all relative, right? Okay, so that's why it's called that. It's called that by the Classical. Now, the Classical period wasn't called classical by themselves. It was called classical by the Renaissance. Okay, in the 15th century AD. Okay, and along with that idea was that this classical period of ancient Greek history was the one that was considered by those in the Renaissance, first in Italy, then in France, then in Holland, to be most emulable, most significant, and worthy of emulation. Okay, and so classical literally comes from classicus, meaning classy, rich, being able to afford fine clothes and fine houses and to socialize in the upper realms of the upper class in society. And so classics has a very elitist pedigree from its very beginning on this idea of those who pretty much have the leisure to study the greatest things that happened in ancient Greece and Rome. Okay, so that's as opposed to what? As opposed to engaging in trade, as opposed to this and that. So that's the idea behind this name, classical. It means it comes from classicus, and a classicus vir, a man who is classic. It means that a guy who is in the upper class. And we're talking about a society in the Renaissance where, at first at least, it wasn't opprobrium. There wasn't an opprobrium attached to, or pollution attached to the idea of walking around dressing up as well as you can to convince everybody how rich you are. Now, there are different aspects of our own society, especially in pop culture, where that is still alive and well. The ones who had the bling were the ones who studied classics. The ones who kept it alive and all that kind of stuff. Okay, and then the last period, and we'll get more to what the archaic and classical and this one were in a second. I'm just giving you an overview first. Then there's the Hellenistic period of ancient Greek history, which is the final one that starts around 300 BC. 323 is the best date to give because it has to do with Alexander the Great's death. Okay, so let's kind of generalize about what's going on with these three periods. Okay, what are the takeaways for us in a class about mythology? Best way to think of it is this. Okay, so what are we doing? We're looking at the gods and the heroes. So where do the gods come from for the ancient Greeks? They come from one major poetic work. And I might as well give you the name now. The author's name is Hesiod, and the work is called the Theogony. Okay, so Hesiod was a poet who supposedly lived at the same time as Homer. So we should think of the beginning of the Archaic period and a little bit into it, so around 750 BC, as the date often, if not usually given, for both Homer and Hesiod. In fact, there was probably an apocryphal, which means BS, story in the ancient world about Homer and Hesiod engaging in a poetic contest, which Homer won. But that was mainly to show that Homer's the best. That probably, you needed a way to compare the two and to say that Homer's the best. So you have a supposed event occurring between them that may or may not have happened. Okay? But the important thing to take away is that at the beginning of the Archaic period, we should associate it with Homer and Hesiod. We'll get to Homer later in the semester. He'll be the star of the class. Hesiod, on the other hand, we're only going to deal with him for pretty much one day. And that'll be next time. Okay? This work, called the Theogony, the etymology of it is Theo has to do with gods, and Goni has to do with the generation or birth. So it means the birth of the gods, the genealogy of the gods, where the gods came from. Okay, but it does more than that. It also goes back further than the gods. And when we say gods in this class, gods and goddesses, we're talking about the Olympians. Okay, the 12 Olympians. As you'll see next time, we're going to differentiate between gods and goddesses, deities, and entities. Okay, because there's pretty much three levels of the beginning of the world according to Hesiod and his Theogony. Interesting. 3 levels. And then you got the 3 levels in history. Seems almost too neat. Maybe it is. Maybe it's not a coincidence. Symmetry is sometimes suspicious. So we'll deal with that idea when we get to it, okay? They like 3s in the ancient world. Okay, so you have Hesiod and his Theogony, and what we're going to do is we're going to look at his take, which was the most authoritative take for the ancient Greeks, on 2 things. One of them is the creation of the universe, and then we're going to look at a thing called succession. So the Theogony is both a creation myth and a succession myth. It's a myth that deals with the creation of the universe from the very beginning, just like Nun and Benben and Osiris, etc., in the Helios creation myth from Egypt. Hence my giving you that one first before we get to Hesiod. And then a succession myth, which deals with the 1, 2, 3 succession, not of history or prehistory, but rather of mythology. And that is the first king of the universe, Uranus, the second king of the universe, Cronus, and the third king and final, really, depending on how you interpret it, if you believe it, which I don't necessarily, but we'll call it that for now, Zeus, the king of the gods in Olympus forever. Okay, so we're going to get to that next time as a segue to getting into learning about all the different gods and goddesses separately. Sometimes one on a given day, other times more than one. And then, like I said, Homer is also around this period. But another thing that's really important about the Archaic period is that unlike the Mycenaean, and as far as we can tell, the Minoan prehistoric civilizations, which were unequivocally and invariably ruled by kings, so they were monarchies. So you had a king, and behind the walls of a palace, he had his retainers, and then everybody else who worked for the king and was protected behind those walls by the people who were the only ones who had the weapons. Now we get into some interesting stuff that I dwell on a lot in my civilization course, but since it's a myth class, I'll kind of throw it out real fast to you guys. There are 2 things that are, or we could even almost call it just one, important in the development from the archaic to the classical period. And if we have to come up with one word for it, although there's different strands leading up to it, it would be democracy. Okay? Where did the idea of rule by the people come from? It's really important to understand. If we have prehistoric civilizations ruled by kings, the question is, how did they develop into civilizations ruled by the citizens? And I didn't say the people, because the heyday of ancient Greek history in the classical period was not ruled by the people, but rather by the citizens. And there's a big difference, because half the population weren't citizens, at least more than half, much more if you count slaves, which you should. The women were not included in that name of democracy whatsoever. When we get to the goddesses, when we get to female heroes, i.e. heroines, things like that, I'll have things to say about all that. But for now, suffice it to say that if we are going to agree with the ancient Greeks, and in particular the Athenians of the classical period, that what counts when you determine whether or not you have a democracy is what those in power, i.e. adult males with the weapons and with the wealth, what they do and what they say is right, then yeah, it was democracy. Okay, so it was legitimately run by the citizens. And that's a big deal. It's a big deal, even though it left out women and slaves, and I'll get more to that later. But how did that happen? And I think, in my book, this is the most interesting aspect of ancient Greece that you never hear about. The Hellenistic period, what you need to know about is that it follows the classical, obviously, and what that means is it follows the heyday of ancient Greece. It follows the period when Athens and Sparta were pretty much what the U.S. and the Soviet Union were in the post-World War II era, all the way up until, 89, 91, depending on what you're talking about. There was that notion in the air in Hellas, what we would call Greece, of the Athenians being by far the most formidable military power when it came to their fleet, when it came to at sea, fighting at sea, and the Spartans, and this was something acknowledged by the Greeks and by the Athenians from the very beginning. The Spartans, as you could probably guess, if nothing else from the movie 300, were by far the most formidable military force on land. So there was always that edge to the historical period of Greece, all the way up to the Hellenistic period. Okay, so how did that happen? There are two major wars that I need to tell you about real fast in order to fill out how it was that the Hellenistic period came and pretty much left the classical period not quite in rubble the way that happened with the Mycenaeans, with whoever the Sea Peoples were, but pretty close to it. Okay, and one of them is an international war, and the other is a civil war. Very analogous to the beginnings of our own history, where you had the Revolutionary War, and then you had the Civil War. Okay, kind of interesting. So, in order to understand how democracy came along, it will dovetail into how the first of those two wars, the International War, arose. And here's how. Let's return back to and sorry I have to jump around, but I have to in order for you to get the whole picture. So in the Minoan Mycenaean Period, we're talking about kings, we're talking about palaces, and we're talking about a long reign of these kings. 1,000 years in the case of Minoan, 1,000 years in the case of Mycenaean, roughly. How did that happen? How was that able to sustain itself? Pretty easily. It all has to do, get ready, with technology. We live in a world now where technology has really taken over, okay? In a way that maybe you guys, since you were born into it, don't realize as much as someone who wasn't born into it does, but back up every once in a while and realize this is a game-changing period we're living in a big way. And that's the case there, okay? So what I want to do is to make this real to you guys is talk in those terms, in terms of a change in technology, because there was a change in one particular aspect of technology that led to democracy. Whoa, that's weird, okay? So what could that possibly be? When you're talking about the time of the kings, there was only one form of wealth, and there was only one form of power, and they came together. The form of wealth was landed property, and the form of rule was being born into the right family with landed property. The only other form of wealth there was weapons. If you think about it, it's as straightforward as that. Didn't have guns, didn't have tanks, didn't have airplanes. You had swords, spears, and shields. And they were expensive, to the extent to where relatively few could afford them. Okay? And guess what? They happened to be, just a coincidence, those who had the landed power, not the landed wealth. So there was a direct correlation, and I'm kidding about the coincidence, by the way. There was a direct correlation between those who had been born in the right families, and by extension, who had the landed wealth, and those who had the weapons. Why would that be? Because think about it. The only way to get weapons is to trade for them. And what is there to trade for them but other weapons? And if you don't have any weapons, you can't trade weapons for weapons. So you can trade land for weapons, all right? But that's no good to someone who doesn't already have land. Get me? So what happens? What has to happen? There's one catalyst. You guys know that word? It's a good word. Catalytic agent. One thing that happened, a game changer. That's another way of putting it. Catalyst is a game changer. Okay? And that game changer was a new form of wealth. A mobile form of wealth. A new form of wealth. What was that? If you only have land and you only have weapons, it's all about belief. It's all about religion. It's all about belief. It's all about the connection between myth and reality. It's all about what we're in this class for to a certain extent and why we're dealing with a day like this. We're looking at ancient Greece itself. It has to do with the fact that for the ancient Greeks, their mythology was more than stories that entertained people. They were stories that featured gods that were actually believed in, to the extent that the ancient Egyptians believed in their gods. And despite the fact that there was a greater stigma attached to death and the afterlife in Greece, and that there was nothing good about it, we shouldn't confuse that with the fact that for the ancient Greeks, despite purely hating the idea of the afterlife and not living for it, you still have people believing very strongly in the need to get the gods on your side when it comes to anything important politically and economically, to the extent to where before wars, you always asked the Oracle of Delphi, okay, with the voice behind it of Apollo, letting you know, do you go to war or not? And we have historical documentation of times when the oracle was unfavorable and whoever was going to be going to war, whichever polis in Greece, whichever didn't go because it was an unfavorable either omen in the sky with birds, etc., or the oracle itself at Delphi. Okay, now this went on to Rome too. We need to understand the depth of this sort of belief in order for what I'm about to tell you to make sense. Okay? If you weren't buried properly, we'll stick with Greece for now. In ancient Greece, you and your family were screwed for eternity. Had to be buried properly. It ruined the whole deal. Okay? And in order to be buried properly, you not only had to have dirt poured on top of your corpse, but you, in order to really do it right, now get ready, had to do something analogous, not nearly as monumental, but something analogous to what the Pharaoh had done for himself with the pyramids in Egypt. Got me? We have to make that connection. And so what's going on here is we're talking about certain items, objects, that were mobile, unlike a pyramid, and were small enough to, even though they were giant, human size, to transport. And it was vases. But when we say vase, we're not talking about the vases you see from 5th century Athens in the museums that are tiny little vases that are beautiful works of art, etc. We're talking about human-sized funerary pots, funerary vases, vessels of various kinds. And they had an iconic aura to them, economically speaking and spiritually speaking, to the point where there was, as far as we can tell, a belief that the better the artist and the better the rendering of these works of art, the better chance you and your ancestors had of going on favorably into the afterlife. So there's a tie between Egypt and Greece. I've been pointing out the difference in the sense that in Egypt, being the king of the underworld wasn't considered to be a bad thing, or even a demotion in the case of Osiris, for Horus to take his place as the sun god. And then in Greece that it was a terrible thing. In Hades, everybody avoided him, this and that. But don't confuse that with the ancient Greeks not taking the idea of a proper burial being important for the fate of the spirit of one living on after their body dies. Okay? So we really do need to change our paradigm here when we're understanding what's going on in the thoughts of the ancient Greeks when it comes to the importance of this stuff in order to understand, yes, the advent of democracy. Why is that? Because finally, there are objects that compete with weapons in value, that can be traded. And guess what? You don't have to already be rich in order to make them. You have to know someone who has the kiln workshops. You had to get in there. But you needed clay, for gosh sakes. And you needed paint. And you needed to be a creative genius. Ooh, right? Look at the times we live in now. Look at how disrupted the big networks are on TV by all the YouTube people. And look at how they're trying to bring them along into the mainstream, and they're getting all scared because they can do nothing but put a camera up, and if they're ridiculously brilliant, they're getting a following that makes those late night TV shows look like a joke in terms of how many people watch. You get me? So we have a similar thing going on now, in my opinion, okay? But let's stick with them, all right? So what happened with them? Now all of a sudden, you have people making things that people with weapons who have enough of them, a surplus of them, are willing to trade those weapons for those other things in order to assure that their ancestors are able to live on properly into the afterlife in a way they can't achieve themselves because they're not as creative, to make the kinds of vessels they need in order for that to occur. Do you get me? And once that happens, it changes the whole game. Because once that happens, all of a sudden, lots and lots of people, slowly but surely, begin to be able to afford weapons. And once that happens, there are new ways of fighting. Wars. Instead of hand-to-hand combat with the few who were able to afford weapons, like in the Iliad, right? Where you have one Greek and one Trojan fighting each other, one after another, for 24 books. All of a sudden you have a new formation, a new way of fighting, named after the name of the very shield that was often traded for these kinds of vessels. And that shield is called a hoplon. And that new form of warfare was called Hoplite Warfare, named after the shield because the person, the soldier who fought using that hoplon was called a hoplite. And how did they fight? Instead of one-on-one, now all of a sudden, you had a bunch of people with weapons, and so instead of one-on-one fighting, there was a wall formed by the people who could afford this armor and these weapons. Okay, now that's not to say, I hope you kind of read between the lines, that's not to say that everyone who has weapons is the same as everyone who is artistic enough to make those kinds of vessels. It's all about trading. It's all about trading. Okay, so when you have an element of society that used to be nothing but considered to be the rabble by the king and his followers, behind the walls of a giant palace, all of a sudden making things that have enough value to slowly but surely lead to extensive trade throughout Greece, where more and more people were able to afford weapons that don't. Of course, also agriculture comes into this, and then eventually olive oil, etc. The whole, then the gates are open. Okay, then it's no longer only the vessels. Now there's this whole world of trade that eventually, as you probably all remember from history books, leads to the formation of a very important thing that also contributed to the advent of quote democracy unquote, and that is the rise of a middle class, the rise of a merchant class, a new class of people who devoted themselves to trade. Okay? And so once you have all those guys with all those weapons and with all that armor, they form a wall, and that's the Hoplite Formation. And you have this giant shield over one shoulder, exposing another shoulder. And then the guy next to you has that big shield that covers the shoulder that is exposed. And vice versa, all the way, not vice versa, but, and so on, like dominoes, leading to this long wall, completely covered by their shields. But as you can tell, just like in football, you have to guard the line. Okay, it's a very football's pattern after war. I don't know if you guys know the very structure of it. So you have a wall of fighters. Now, what does that mean? How does that lead to democracy? Because think about it. The king behind the walls doesn't have guns. He's not Tony Montana. He doesn't live in a palace with a bunch of machine guns and a bunch of people defending him with machine guns. He doesn't have anything more or less than the same weapons that those outside his walls have. And now he's outnumbered. So now he has to figure out what the hell happens. And what happens is he eventually gets deposed, if not killed. And then the people give it a shot. Nobody, unfortunately, has the documentation to prove the events that led up to the transition from monarchy to democracy in all of its details. But the key is that. The key is that with a new form of fighting and a new necessity for that kind of fighting in order to compete with enemies, whether foreign or within one's own, we'll call it nation for now, they too, right, are part of that revolution. And they too have access to all those weapons, and they too have to rely on hoplite warfare in order to compete with, in this case, say the Athenians or the Spartans. You see? So it ups the game. And so there's no more, you can't just say, hey, we're gonna stay kings. We're gonna be the kings behind the walls, and we're just pretend everything's cool. No, because they're gonna be overrun easily. Okay, because of everybody who has the weapon. There's no tanks or airplanes that the king has advantage over everybody outside the walls by means of at all. And so there needs to be this new way of doing things. And so, as you can guess, from that point on, the people demanded more and more say in what goes on politically, okay, and by extension economically. And so there's a long list of things that occur. For example, at first they demand a law code. So what those in power, still in power, it takes a while for things to change, what those in power are able to tell the rest of the population to do, at least is done according to a law code as opposed to arbitrarily. That's the first thing that happens, leading up to democracy. Okay, the second thing that happens is, as you could probably guess, okay, like say we were the last ones on Earth. Think of kind of a Walking Dead scenario, all right? Eventually, as time, or lost, okay, eventually, or survivor. Eventually, what's going to happen is that there will be this kind of status thing, and people will get a sense of who is smartest, who is strongest, who is most courageous, this and that, and they'll edge up to pretty much start being the leaders. Okay, that's just the way it's always happened. Okay, maybe not with us. Maybe with us it'd be nothing but hey, everything's great all the time. But it usually happens that way. Okay, and so almost always in history, and we'll just stick with ancient Greece for now. Always, in every polis in all over Greece, there was always one leader who emerged that the people depended on to guide them. Okay, and he always had, not coincidentally, was a military guy. Okay? He was one of the best fighters, and more importantly, reflecting the importance of Athena. Like what we will talk about. Athena being the goddess of war, yeah, but really the strategic aspects of war. The aspects of war that deal with, strategy. Okay, and so that becomes extremely important in all of the different areas of Greece, including Athens. And so one person eventually is given power by the people, and that person becomes known as the tyrannos. The tyrant is one of the people who eventually gains the respect and authority from the rest of the people to rule a given city-state. And just about all the city-states follow this pattern, including Athens. Okay? And so what's going to happen? Ever hear of a guy named Napoleon? Okay, so remember what happened? Napoleon was one of the champions of the people during the Revolution, the French Revolution, 1789, blah, blah, blah. And then once he came into power, all of a sudden, oops, he becomes kind of, takes power into his own hands and becomes a tyrant in the bad sense of the word rather than the neutral or even good sense of the word that it originally had in ancient Greece. So originally the word tyrant, believe it or not, didn't have a negative connotation to it. It just meant the guy who was given the power because it was expedient and it was pragmatic for there to be a head to the body politic, if you will. Otherwise, you have just the body trying to walk itself. You had to have a figurehead. You had to have someone that was in charge of something. And this will happen in Rome as well. But then that person abused his power, was overtaken, either killed or exiled, and then it just kept on going until people were like, this is ridiculous. And so what happened? This happened in Greece and this happened in Rome. The one figurehead, the one tyrant, notice I'm not using the word king because it was a charade that the tyrant wasn't a king because kings were the things from the past. Tyrants are different. Oh, really? How different are they? Okay. So what happens is once each of these city-states tries out enough tyrants, eventually it becomes apparent that it's just not a practical governing paradigm. And so the people all of a sudden say, we need something instead of one person ruling everybody because the one person becomes too corrupt. We have to rule it together. How the hell are we going to do that? The Athenians in the 5th century BC deserve the credit for arranging how to do that. And so those are the roots of democracy in especially 5th century Athens. What happens is once those roots are laid down and the tree grows from them and everything seems pretty amazing, because when you buy those coffee table books about the glory that was Greece, cost $7 in the bargain section of Barnes & Noble, what it almost always has to do with is 5th century Athens. Why is that? Because first of all, we know more about 5th century Athens than anywhere else because there's more documentation from it that we can rely on to say things about it. That's the less interesting fact. The other one is that there's just so much cool stuff that comes from it when it comes to especially art. So when you talk about the Greek tragedies, you talk about the Greek comedies, you talk about oratory, you talk about proto-science and then eventually science, all kinds of things, that a lot of which we're going to be talking about in this class because it's all connected to mythology. They're pretty much the delivery mechanisms for mythology, if you want to think of it that way. Then it's apparent that there's a reason for 5th century Athens to be considered, the leader of the Greeks in that period of its history. But what happens is, as time goes on, and Athens starts kind of coasting along with their status as, the most successful democracy, and really the only, strictly speaking, and even then within the parameters of not considering women as part of society, which, that's why you put quotes around it. But there was an envy around Greece, and especially by Sparta. Sparta, as you guys know from the movie 300, and if you've read Herodotus, you know that Sparta was not only the most formidable military force on land in Greece, but they weren't crazy about the idea of Athens getting the reputation of being the leaders of Greece. They wanted to be the leaders of Greece. So that was always in the air in the archaic and classical period of Greek history. But before that blew up, something intervened. And that was in 490 BC, the beginning of that international war I referred to called the Persian Wars. Now, the Persian Wars had to do with a lot of stuff. But the main thing it had to do, the cause of the Persian Wars had to do with the fact that the Persian Empire in the east had power over certain islands of Greece, the people of which agreed to pay tribute each year to the Persian Empire in order to be allowed to carry on their life the way they want to live it as opposed to being part of the Persian Empire. At first that went okay for a decade or two. But then there were some islands that rebelled, and they didn't like the idea. They didn't want to have to pay that tribute, and so what they did when they rebelled is they asked help from the Greeks, and in particular from the Athenians. Okay, now you know where that's going. So the Athenians agreed to help them out, and then the Persian Empire wanted to punish the Greeks for doing that, and thence begins the first battle, first major battle of the Persian Wars, called the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC. Okay, the Greeks won mainly because the Persians underestimated the military force of the Greeks. Okay, so, the Greeks didn't allow themselves to get too big of a head about it. So then 10 years later, finally, the Persians came back for more, this time more, better prepared, in 480 BC, with the second major battle of the Persian Wars, which is called Thermopylae. 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 Okay, it means the hot gates. And that's the name of that pass that we know about from the movie 300. Famously, we all know that the Greeks lost that battle, but it was due to the courage of the 300. And this is the story that the Greeks told, and historians and archaeologists have different opinions about who was really left behind. It began with 1,400, and then it got down to 300, and then as far as when you get into numbers and you get into Herodotus, you get into big troubles. Okay, to the extent to where there's one famous passage where he talks about either there were 300,000 or 3 million troops. Okay, now I don't have to bore you with which particular battle that was, but the point is that you take numbers with a grain of salt with Herodotus. But it is important to understand that the gist of it is that Thermopylae was best known in the ancient world as kind of a way for the Spartans to display their courage in a way that supposedly gave the Greeks enough confidence to go into the next year, before 79 BC, in the decisive battle of the Persian Wars called Salamis, Salamis, which was fought by sea for reasons that there was a general who came up with the idea to build up the fleet in order to compete best with the Persian Empire. And then eventually the Greeks, at least from the standpoint of themselves, won the Persian Wars. Okay, now, Alexander the Great would later disagree with that. So for all intents and purposes, the Greeks win the Persian Wars, 479 BC. And then from that point on, very important stuff here, okay, continuing on with what we said earlier about democracy. Then a new general comes into the picture, and his name is Pericles. Pericles becomes the new figurehead of Athens after the Persian Wars. And he convinced the rest of Greece that because they had taken upon themselves the greatest responsibility for winning the Persian Wars, which was true, despite Thermopylae with the Spartans. If it hadn't been for the Athenians, there's no way the Greeks would have won the Persian Wars. So the Athenians made it clear to the rest of Greece, especially Pericles in particular, that, hey guys, we don't want this kind of stuff happening anymore. Okay, we have these three major battles, including, there were other battles as well, but three major ones. And as far as we can tell, that's the end of the Persian Wars, but we don't know for sure. So we need someone to pretty much do for all of Greece what the chief executive of a given city-state, whether it be king, whether it be what are called archons or whatever, does within each polis, within each city-state. And that is be pretty much the main figurehead or main protector of all of Greece. And you guessed it, it's me, Pericles. It's us, the Athenians. Because without us, you guys would be screwed. So what you need to do, you rest of Greece, pretend you were all places in Greece and then multiply it by 10 times. Each of you is a leader, whether a tyrant, whether a general, whatever, of each of those places. What I'm telling all of you, just me, just one guy, okay? I'm telling you, you need to come to Athens every year. First, it's to a different place called Delos, an island that is more neutral than Athens. But then it moves to Athens. You have to come to Athens every year and pay tribute. Does that ring a bell? Persian king? Okay. You need to come and pay tribute every year, and what we'll do, we're the ass kickers. We're the ones with all the allies. We're the ones, we're the best fighters, this and that. You come every year and pay tribute, and that tribute will go into protection. It'll go into safeguarding there not being a continuation any longer of this horrible war that we just finished. Okay? And that works for a while, but then there's a problem, and that is Sparta. Sparta eventually convinces a bunch of you to take their side. And then what happens is slowly but surely, there's this kind of draft that occurs between Athens and Sparta. So we'll take you guys, you take you guys, etc. This is called Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, in other words, the Civil War of Greece, that eventually is at the end of the classical period. And so it really is like a football draft. And it's a matter, if you read it, it's fascinating stuff, you guys, if you're into that kind of stuff, if you're into politics, read Thucydides, believe me. And then eventually the alliance systems of Athens and Sparta are formed. There's a war between them, and Sparta kicks Athens' ass. Stupid Athens, okay? It was not even close. And no, they didn't destroy Athens. They said, okay, you knew that we could do this to you guys, so what we'll do, we'll let you continue being the leader of Greece when it comes to culture, but now we're the new kid in town when it comes to protecting everybody politically, this and that. Well, the problem was, and it all comes down to this, and this is the last thing, that Sparta wasn't as successful at PR as Athens was, okay? And so they weren't able to keep things together. And so that caused a vacuum. From the north comes Philip II, who's the father of Alexander the Great. And then after Alexander is dead, it initiates the Hellenistic period that we'll talk about when we get to the hero Jason.